Canon has a very good reputation from the lenses it produces in the quality of the build, in the sharpness around the edges, the sharpness in the middle, the reliability of the colors being reproduced the correct way. So with the Canon R1, in my humble opinion, one of the best lenses, I can say this even more specifically, from every camera and lens I've seen, the 28 to 70 millimeter Canon f/2.0, so it's a 2.0 f-stop, is by far the best lens I've ever seen. That's quite a statement, but it is a sweet lens. It lets you film internally and externally. It comes out a little bit when you zoom in, but I've done so many interviews inside an office with this beautiful lens that I stopped changing. I started making this as my almost always lens. They say one and done, but I'm not quite at the stage where I can travel just with this one lens, but it is almost always in my bag. Sometimes not just on its own, but it's almost always in my bag. Autofocus, etc., but really, really, really sharp. Why f2.0? So let me show you what this looks like with the complete setup. So remember, we're doing this upside down just to not get any dust, not to let any dust in. Yeah, the more you practice with these, the easier they'll fit on. So this is what it looks like with the 28 to 70 lens. That's the lens extended. So there's not a very big difference between open and close. In fact, you could do it with just a half turn. But this setup at f2.0 is going to give you some of the best photos that you've ever seen. The megapixels on this, meaning that the sensor that records the dots, the pixels, is rated at 24.2. When I say rated, you think, okay, well, why don't I just say it is 24.2? It's because it's a rectangle and there's dots around the edges that aren't always used. So sometimes it takes all the boxes that can take the light coming in, but it reduces it to make sure there's no spill around the edges. Quite often that comes when you switch on the anti-shake facility of it. So there's something called an image stabilizer. You think, like, obviously if you come from a camera background, you know what image stabilization is. But let's say you don't. Let's say that you're in the real estate game, you're in the property game, and you're thinking, well, I don't need to get my subject, the person who I'm taking a photo of, to be stable. I want the camera to be stable. What image stabilization does is, if the camera is moving, it balances the edges, it cuts out the edges so that it can average something that's a little bit sideways and a little bit like this, and brings them together by cutting out a smaller rectangle so that they both fit into the same dots that it's plotted. So it works out roughly where it should go. Then the internal sensor puts together the right information, usually where the edges go from a dark to a light, so you can tell when a sharp line should be, the horizon of an ocean, a shirt color, a change in a hairstyle. It says, okay, well, first image looks like this, second image looks like that. Let's put them together and then line them up so that one is over the other exactly. And because one is a rectangle like this, one is a rectangle like that, do it this way. One is a rectangle like this, one is a rectangle like that. When it overlays them, the part that's correct has to be sliced, which means the photo becomes smaller. 2.4 megapixels, 24.2 megapixels is cut down, so you might get a functional 20 megapixels, or you might get 18 megapixels, depending on how much shake there was in the image stabilization. This lens, this Canon 28-70, very clear lens, very crisp lens, very demure, very, very good quality lens. It does not have any stabilization. So there's no built-in system that works like a gimbal, that has some sort of a gyroscope inside that tells it, hey, we're shaking too much, let's stabilize things. There is no stabilization on this lens, but it's one of my favorites. So what do? The Canon R1, the body, has inbuilt body image stabilization. So that's IBIS. That means that internally it has in-body image stabilization. That means that I can still get a little bit of movement, but the photo still looks in focus. Why? Because this has actually got two computer systems inside. One is a computer chip to take the image, another one is a computer chip to do the calculations. So one accepts the image, one does the calculations, and then they come to your memory card and give you the answer that is the best possible photo you can get, according to the computer system. So why? Why do you want that? Well, let's say somebody's playing sports. So when the school hired me to take photos of the band, some of the songs were played on a violin. As you can imagine, the bow of the violin, the edge of the bow moves faster than the hand because it's a long bow. So if somebody playing on violin moves and the bow becomes blurry unless you take a very quick photo. If you get a little bit of motion, the face that's in focus might be in focus while the bow or the strings on the bow are out of focus. I noticed that a lot when one of the players had longer hair and it had a bright surface behind them. And so before using the R1, I would get funny lines through the hair that didn't look like a natural hair. It looked like pixels or straight lines that were artificial. With the Canon R1, with the internal in-body stabilization, IBIS, even if your lens, and even a great quality lens like the 28-70 f2.8, even if it doesn't have image stabilization, the body has in-body image stabilization. So you do get more of that effect where it just looks in focus, it looks better. It also means you can take photos faster without having to worry about that transition of, if I go too fast, it reduces the light coming in. Because the reality is, if you're trying to capture something, if they're just about to sink a basketball, if they're just about to kick the soccer ball through the hoop, through the goal, you're not always going to be at the right spot at the right time unless you can very quickly click, 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 click and get to the next one. So this is very faster clicking. With the in-body stabilization, you can get an image where it calculates it correctly. And that means that you can allow yourself a little bit more time to do the more important things, like get the colors right by setting the ISO, the aperture, the f-stop, all the settings correct, and the focus point is pointed the right way. That's going to bring me into how this iFocus works. But before I do that, I want to say, okay, well, this is a great lens together with in-body image stabilization and the lens that doesn't have stabilization. You're getting the magic of two worlds. So this is a 28-70, which means that you can have a very close, say 30 centimeters away, 50 centimeters away subject. So you can point to your subject that you're interviewing nearby without having to worry about it being too close to focus. And these lenses have autofocus, which means that as long as you half depress the button, it'll find the focal point. With the R1, it finds the focus faster. It uses an algorithm, a computer system that finds it faster once you teach it what you want. There are very specific options on this for soccer, for basketball, for netball. It's not for every sport. I saw a very good review, and this is a shout out. If you've been here for watching the whole video, thank you, first of all. But a big shout out to Simon from Ordinary Filmmaker. Have a look at YouTube, subscribe to Simon. Ordinary Filmmaker, I watch it almost religiously. So multiple times a week, Simon produces a video to explain what's coming, what the shortfalls are, how to analyze, even things that are written in Japanese for Canon. He's got a computer system that generates a translation, and he reads the patent application from 2 years ago to see what's the new lens structure coming out, what is the new camera coming out, and to predict to a certain level of accuracy how the new camera is going to be different to the old ones. So if you're thinking about holding off until the R0 comes out because you feel that the R1 is better than the R3, but maybe there'll be something better in the future, and maybe they'll call it the R0. They've never done that before. You never know, but pay attention to what Ordinary Filmmaker says. Simon is just great, always producing new content, and the quality is very high. You'll find that there's titles on the side at the same time as he's talking, and you can get the understanding of what he's doing without any ads. So a lot of the stuff he does, he has codes where you can buy the lenses or buy the bodies from one of his friends in Canada. He lives out in Canada, but without putting on another 20-second ad or 30-second ad to say, hey, this is sponsored by. So very interesting system. Simon, if you're watching this, thank you. I'm consuming your stuff all the time, and we've had a few chats via email a few times, so I appreciate you answering my comments. Thank you. So going back to the 28-70, this is a great lens, really fantastic. Doesn't have image stabilization, but the body does. So if we change from this lens, let me make sure it's off, and we'll put this upside down so it doesn't expose the sensor to any dust particles. I'm going to change over to, let's go to this one next. So this is 28 millimeters to 70 millimeters. This one is 35. It's only 35. It doesn't zoom in or zoom out. This is a lens that has autofocus. Now, if you grew up in the 80s or you grew up in the 90s, you probably realize that so many cameras came out with autofocus. It was like, well, it's just like having seatbelts in cars. You just expect it. This is a lens that doesn't have autofocus. It is only a manual focus lens. We spoke about this being an f2.0. That means it lets in more light than the big lens that had f2.8. We spoke about the aperture, the hold at the opening. We spoke about the ISO, and we spoke about the f-stop. So this big lens that I love is an f2.0. Generally, the bigger the f-stop, the bigger and heavier and healthier the bigger and heavier lens gets to be. So this is a 2.0. Let me put this new lens on, and I'll explain to you why this is such a special lens. Yeah, I should really speed this up in post. So whenever you get me fiddling around with the neck strap and not talking, then I'll try to speed that up in post. Okay, so we're putting this one away, the 28-70, and this is called a petal. So this little lens cap, instead of being that full circle like you had before, this is called a petal style. And the reason for that is because it zooms in to a 70 millimeter or a 28 millimeter. If you had a full circle, you would actually notice the edge in your photos. And so you don't want to have something that's an obvious shadow or an obvious edge, because it's going to ruin your photo. Okay. Now we'll go to 35. We'll take a break here. Okay, so now we're going to start from the the part where the camera is now charged up. So what you'll see is that I am doing a measurement and a test of the shorter form of lenses. So when we measure the distance between the subject and the lens, this is the R1, and now the battery is fully charged on the R1. So what does that mean? That means I can actually show you a test from each of the lenses that we have here to show you the difference of why in a close range an R1 can use a much better lens to better use. And I'm going to share with you the actual footage that comes out of the R1, Canon R1 body with these different lenses. So the first one, we're talking about the aperture and the way that the lower the number, the bigger the hole, which means more light comes in. But it also means that from the distance of the actual focus to out of focus is a much shallower depth of field, meaning that there's very little difference. When you move a little bit, you're out of focus. A little bit forward, you're out of focus. You have to stand still, and the camera has to stand still. Or if you're moving, the camera has to move the same distance to you. So we really have to keep that measurement quite tight. So let's do the first recording sample. I do have to get used to where the buttons are on this. There you go. That's recording. So we are now on a 1/25 frame rate and an ISO of 100, which means that it's still quite bright. Like the image looks really clear and bright, but you'll see as I move a little bit on the footage, you'll be able to see that it comes in and out of focus. So let's have a look at when you're measuring the distance, you're usually measuring from the body, so from where the sensor is, not from the edge of the lens. What that means is depending on which lens you're using, some lenses are very short, they're pancake lenses, and some lenses are deeper. But because you're always measuring from the sensor, it's going to be the same length. So we're going to estimate the sensor is at the edge of where the lens plugs in to keep it consistent. So when this is locked in to the closest distance. So we have this lens is a 0.95 f-stop, f/0.95. And we're looking at about 30 centimeters there. That won't do the whole focus. The closest I can come is this, which is just over. So that's your 30 centimeter mark. And then we have roughly another 10 centimeters. So I'm in focus. As I move 10 centimeters away, I'm out of focus. In focus, out of focus. So looking straight down the barrel, in focus and out of focus. And this is the 35mm manual focus lens. It is really interesting to see the edges. You see that even my ear is out of focus when it's there, and as it comes closer, it becomes in focus. So you can really see when you're speaking to somebody, and it's the idea is to capture the subject directly, to really focus the story on the person you're focusing on. This lens is fantastic for that. We're using a very low ISO, an ISO of 100, a 1/25 frame rate, which means that it lets a lot of light in, but you're not getting any of the problems from noise. The lower the ISO, the clearer the picture. If you can, you can really see how shallow it is. Because if my nose is in focus, you can have my nose and my eyes in focus, but then my ears are not in focus. It's that shallow. Let's switch to the next lens. This was 35 f/0.95. Let's have a look at the next one, which is another 35, but with an f-stop starting with 1. Always switch the power off before you swap the lenses out. And if you remember the little hints and tips that we were talking about before, you don't want to get anything into where the sensor lives. So when you're changing out the lens, make sure that you're facing the camera down so that the sensor doesn't get any dust in it. If you can avoid it at all, sometimes the wind is blowing and you can't avoid it, and these things can be cleaned. But if you can, if you have the choice, then make the right choice. I have a 24 to 50 lens, and this one's a f4.5 to 6.3. I also have a 10 to 20, and that is an f-stop of 4.0 or f4, and a 35 1.8. So for the next thing, we'll do the 35 1.8. Trying not to move where the camera is, because the fewer things we can change, the easier it is to predict what the result is going to be. So I'm keeping the tripod where it was. That's a beautiful lens. I hope you really enjoyed that. 35mm with an f-stop of 0.95. This lens is made by a company called Lauer. It's called the Argus. It's my little sound effects, thank you. L-A-O-W-A, Lauer. There you go. It's the Lauer brand of lens. 35mm. Now, for a long time, this was my favorite lens because it has image stabilization. So remember we spoke about the larger lenses and the difference between having image stabilization, which crops some of the things together, or using a camera like this that has in-body image stabilization. So the Canon R1 has an in-body image stabilization. This lens also on the side has a stabilization mode on or off. I'm going to keep the 1 of 25, but what I do want to change is the f-stop to get the lowest possible f-stop. So if you remember, this isn't a pop quiz, but if you remember what the previous lens was, it was not autofocus. In fact, the previous lens that we used was a manual focus, 35mm, like this one. This one's a 35mm, the previous was a 35mm, but the difference is this one has an f1.8, the previous one had an f0.95. If you can see that my eyes are in focus, at this distance, my eyes and my ears look like they're both in focus. The further I get with the autofocus, the easier it is for the camera to have both my ears and my eyes in focus and the tip of my nose. And with the previous one, we noticed that if one thing was in focus, maybe the eyes were in focus, but the ears were not. And the depth of field was much shallower, meaning that a little bit of a movement meant that you're out of focus. Great lens, image stabilization, and with the 35mm, it's a very easy lens to speak to when you're doing a blog or a vlog, when you're recording yourself. Even if you've got a selfie stick that extends, that gives you a little bit of a distance, we're going to measure the distance of the nearest focal point. I feel like I could even get closer than that, and I think my eyes are still in focus. So that's 30 centimeters. Now exactly 30 centimeters from the body, and there's no problem at all. I'm in focus, I'm clear. The good thing about being this close is that the audio comes through. The downside is sometimes you can have a little spittle on the lens, which means that you're constantly carrying around a microfiber cloth to keep that lens a little bit cleaner. Now this is even though it's a very good 35mm f1.8, it's not an L series lens. An L series lens usually has a ring of red around it, so it's got a circle around the lens that tells you it's an L series. That's what Canon calls their professional lenses. This one is their standard lens, not their professional lens. Let's try out the next lens, which we're going to look at. There you go, not in focus. At 24 to 50. So 24 to 50, there you go. Nope. Canon 24 to 50. Again, not an L series lens, just a really basic lens. Does it have image stabilization? I don't think it does. Yes, it does. It has image stabilization, but remember this is an f4.5 to 6.3. So as you saw with the previous one, I'm still at ISO 100, I'm still at 1/25, this is f1.8, and it looks like it's a little bit darker than the previous image. The other one, because we had a larger aperture, because the f9.5, 0.95 opened more, it let more light in, it meant that for the same settings, it was picking up a brighter video. When we go down to this one, if I keep the setting the same, you'll see it's very, very dark. So once we've tested it, I'll actually turn one of the features up. It'll probably be the ISO, because if I try to get the frame rate slower, it won't be a good video. I will get good at being able to do this from behind the camera. I'm still not at the stage where I'm fluent at it, but you know, these things take a little bit of practice. And then once you've got the practice of making these changes on your own without having a second set of hands, you can do very quick flip changes like this one. Okay, so that's the 35 f1.8, and now we've just put in the 24 to 50 image stabilized RF 24 to 50. With this lens, you actually need to open it first. Yeah, that's at the 50mm, that's at the 24. So let's start with the 24. Okay, so straight away with the 24, you can see that the proximity, I can be incredibly close and it's still in focus. So this is now about 20 centimeters. Where's 10, 20 centimeters, yep, even 20 centimeters in focus. As I move it out towards the 50mm range, then to be in focus, it's really hard to tell because the image, you'll see when I play this back, the image is actually really dark. So let's try to change one of the ISOs to see if we can improve the image. ISO 200, ISO 400, we're getting much better. ISO 800, ISO 1600, ISO 3200 is overexposed. So let's go down to 1600. Okay, so 1600, and okay, so at 1600, when we're down at 24mm, it's a much closer zoom. So we were measuring the top line. 22 centimeters. Could probably get down to 20. So around 20 centimeters is still, everything's in focus, but you can see the difference now between this at f4.5 and the 0.95. It's a dramatic difference. Remember we were talking about my ear not being in focus, or my nose and ear not always being in focus at the same time? This is an autofocus lens. It keeps my eyes, my ears, my nose, my face in focus, but you'll see even the things behind me are in focus. So you get a little bit less control, because at the end of the day, it's a wider lens, which means that whether you want it or not, you're getting some background things that you may not want to share. When you zoom into a 50, yes, you're getting a much closer range, and guess what's the 35? So this is the 35, just like the other 35. That I'm in focus here at 20 centimeters, 24 centimeters. So it's a bit more flexible, and it does give you that little bit of movement backwards and forwards. You know, they call this a kit lens. They call it that because it comes together with one of the cameras. This particular one comes with the Canon R8. It's an RF 24-50, f 4.5 to 6.3, IS STM. IS is the image stabilized bit that we spoke about before. Still a good lens. I see, like, it's clear, it's crisp. When you increase it to 24, it goes down to an f4.5 automatically, so the picture actually gets brighter very quickly. And as you bring it down, the picture gets darker to an f3.5, and it does it all automatically. Let's change it up to go to something that's not a 35mm. So this one we actually had down at the 35mm. This is 35mm now. But I'm going to show you a lens that is one of the L series lenses, but on a close proximity. Remember we looked at that 28 to 70? I said it was one of the best lenses. I didn't qualify it. I actually said it is the best lens I've ever used. So that's the 28 to 70, and that's an L series lens. It had a really big glass element on the front. This one's smaller, but it still has a very good glass element on the front, and it is an L series lens. So I'm going to show you that one next. It's the 10 to 20. It's not a fisheye, but it's a 10 to 20 that shows you straight lines on the edge. Let's have a look at that next. There you go. So we have a look now at a lens that looks like, if you can see the front element from there, it looks curved. So the front of the element is curved. It's not a fisheye lens, but it can look like one. So let's get this. Oh, that's not sitting. There you go, that's sitting better. Last thing you want is your brand new Canon R1 falling off the stand. So, wow, okay. I'm going to, first of all, even before I start recording, I'm going to change the ISO because this is an f4. So we're going to go straight to the 800 because 1600 is already overexposed. Welcome. So this is at 1/25, that's the frame rate. It's at f4. So this lens is an f4 lens. And remember we looked at 3 different 35mm lenses. One was 35 f/0.95. The next one was a 35 1.8. And the third one had the range where you could choose 35 because it went from 24 all the way up to 50. So the 24 to 50 when set at 35 was running at about 4.5 to 6.3. That's the range. So you'd assume at 35 it'll probably be approximately the f5. This is now an f4. Let's have a look at 2 things. First of all, is this image stabilized? Yes, it is. Does it have autofocus? Yes, it does. Can you see how close I can get and still be in focus? And you can tell because my nose, my eyes, my ears are going to be either in or out of focus. We are set currently to the 20mm range, but this is a very wide range. So let's use our trusty ruler and work out very approximately, but where 20 centimeters is. So when I get to the 20 centimeter mark, my chin is at the 20 centimeter. I feel like I'm really, really close to this lens, but I think it's in focus. When I go wider, so that's a 10. If we go to from 20 to a 10, that is massive. I mean, look at how much room. Imagine filming with this in your car. So let's see, getting closer. I'm like a centimeter away from the lens, so I'm not even comfortable with this. But it's a lens where you can talk at it very close up without getting too expanded. Because if I'm here and I move a little bit sideways, can you see how everything stretches out? This is a great weight loss plan. Just start here, and as you lose weight, you come closer. I'm only kidding. But you get the idea that it stretches out the sides. If you're in the middle of the camera, so if you've got 2 people and they're both in the center of the stage, both talking, you can get away with this. If one person's on the extreme and the other person's in the middle, it doesn't look right at the 10mm. Because remember, this is the widest it's going to get. So the 10mm, you're going to get a very strange look. But guess what? When you're doing a room, when you're doing landscape, when you're doing something where you actually want to show the people that are not just the one person, but multiple, you can do it with a 10. I feel that 20 is a much nicer look, and it's easier to control. A 20 almost looks fully natural. A 35 is supposed to be the number that's the magic number. But with the Canon R1, what it does is, because of the autofocus on the R1, whether you're taking photos or video, if you're set at 20, you're still getting a massive image width when you set the lens parallel to the ground. So if it's not tilted up or tilted down, there's less increase on the sides. So this lens compensates for that curve. So you don't get something which feels like you're traveling towards a direction, like you're getting the fisheye lens. It actually has internal compensation for that. And that's done partly with the body. With the Canon R1, there's software inside that is pre-programmed specifically for that lens. What that does is really just cuts out the rectangle into a slightly smaller rectangle to compensate for the bits that are exaggerated on the extreme right and left of the lens. You can switch that off, but why would you? You can call it pin cushioning, you can call it warping. At the end of the day, you don't want something that doesn't look natural because it's not going to translate. But I think this actually, I really think this image looks good. We were talking about the 25mm. So there you go, the f25, sorry, the 35mm, the f35 f1.8, the 35 f0.95, which is that one, and we were talking about the 24 to 50. They're all very good lenses to use close up. Probably my favorite lens at the moment is the one that we're using right now. It's a 10 to 20mm L series lens. So that means that it has more water sealing. So it works, it's not waterproof, but the moisture doesn't get into it as easily. The dust doesn't get into it as easily. It protects the lens, protects the body much better. It has rubber grommets. The seals are silicone or rubber on the inside, so as it clicks together, the electrical contacts get in touch with the other electrical contacts, and they're sealed within something that doesn't let the wind, the rust, the air, the moisture through. Useful, but the biggest thing is now you can hold your camera closer, talk at it, and the microphone that's built in onto the R1, or even if you're using a lapel mic or you're using a shotgun mic or a boom mic, the closer you can get to the source, the easier it is to not have an accident where somebody trips over, or you need to spend time to coordinate how far the microphone is from the source. So if you can have everything all in one, it makes it much easier to do a single person shoot. Now let's talk property and real estate. If I'm out of Sydney, I don't want to carry too many things with me. I don't want to carry an extra suitcase just for my camera gear. So if I can have one lens, I might take this lens. I think it weighs 570 grams. You can Google that, you don't need me to tell you. But have a look at the 10 to 20 millimeter from Canon. Have a look at how much it weighs, the dimensions. The R1 body is already quite heavy, but you only need one battery to last you the whole day. So if you're not taking your charger, you're only taking one camera, you're only taking one tripod, you're only taking one lens. If you can cover a lot of the shoots you're going to do, you might take one extreme like a 10 to 20 and another extreme like an 800. And between the two on one trip, you've taken two very lightweight lenses. Have a look at the RF 800 f/11, the f11. It's a very light lens. The 10 to 20 is a very light lens. The other one that I might consider taking with me if I'm going somewhere where I know that there's community at night and community during the day, if I want to show a night scene, the f0.95 is very good. It's a 35 millimeter, so it looks like the natural eye. It is heavier. It's actually a metal casing. It's very heavy. It's one of the heaviest lenses from a non-L series lens, but it's very accurate. It doesn't have image stabilization. It doesn't have autofocus, but that's the benefit, because when you bring it down to the 0.95, you're blurring out a lot of the background. So whatever you're filming, you don't need to worry about people doing strange things in the background, because you're only focused on just the person who's in focus. Anything that's a meter back or a meter front is already out of focus. So you can really take it into a situation where you don't particularly want to see the writing on the wall. You don't want to be able to read what's written on there. You don't want to let your audience know the people who are walking by. You want them to have an image and understanding that there's motion, that there's excitement in the area, but without specifically saying, hey, this is this particular street on this particular corner with this particular shop and that brand name. Because reality is that a lot of the stuff you do is more about the feeling for how the community feels, instead of the specifics of there's 3 Thai restaurants, 1 Japanese restaurant, and 1 McDonald's. People don't really care about the specifics. They care about the fact that there's a nightlife. So bringing a camera with a lens that's really good at low light, and a body like the Canon R1 that's also really good at low light, means you're traveling with less gear. You're taking the things that are meant for, that are specific for. Remember right at the beginning we said, what do you call the best? How do you classify something as the best camera out there? I classify it as something that I can use without having to get another camera, to take with me 2 cameras. The reality is I'm always taking my mobile phone with me. So for the normal stuff, a mobile phone is enough. For nighttime shots, or for day shots, or for long distance shots, I'm always going to take the better camera, because a 2x adapter with an 800 lens is going to be 1600. As long as I have a Canon R1 and I know that I can get rid of the noise when you're filming something in f22 or taking a photo at f22, your either going to have a very, very dark photo, or you're going to do a very long exposure. The long exposure, you don't want to wobble because that'll just look blurry, which means you want something with image stabilization. So the 800mm lens has its own image stabilization. The R1 has its own in-body image stabilization. When you bring the two together, you can take a slower photo that opens the lens for longer, receives more light, but then it might have a little bit of noise. So yes, it's not blurry, but you want to get rid of the little dots that look like dots of white on a black background. That's called noise. If you can denoise it, if you can get rid of the noise in an easy way, then you're traveling with one camera body, potentially two lenses, maybe a 35 f0.95, maybe an 800 f11. If you're taking a longer trip and you feel that you can do some interviews, then definitely recommend the 10 to 20 because it works on a car, it works inside the light rail, and because you're close enough to the subject that's speaking, the microphone can pick up what they're saying much better. So that's my very quick review of the Canon R1. I love to travel, I love to see Australia. One of the things that I've never seen that I'd love to go to is Cooper Pedy in South Australia. I'm based out in Sydney, but a lot of the clients that are approaching me are asking me to go somewhere instead of them because they're busy doing their day job. They're busy with their family. So that means sometimes I have an excuse to go to some of the best beaches in Australia. I've had an excuse to go to the Gold Coast, to Sunshine Coast, even headed down to Tasmania in 7 Mile Beach, close to Hobart in Tasmania. And Broome, if you get a chance to go to Broome in Western Australia, definitely take it up. Eco Beach Resort was incredible. So there's a lot of more depth that we can go into, and the specifics, the technical things, I didn't want to cover, so I'll leave it to you to actually go to Google and find out. If you have any questions, post them, ask the question in the comment, and I don't check YouTube, I don't check the links very often, but I do respond, so I will, once I look back at it, I'll respond to you. And if you have any technical questions or questions about what lens you need to get or how one of the lenses behaves in a certain area at nighttime, at low light, at long distance, and you'd like a sample of a photo, let me know and I'll post it for everybody. Because guess what? If you've got that photo, if you've got that lens, if you've got that camera, why not share your experience? And that's how I feel. And from your perspective, if you're asking a question, you'll probably find that there's a lot of other people who just haven't raised their hand to ask the question, but one answer might answer a lot of people who were thinking of asking and just didn't get around to it. So yeah, ask me the questions you want, and happy to help. And let me know if you bought the Canon R1 and if you're happy with it. I know I'm happy with it so far. The battery life is incredible. Anyway, have fun, and I'll see you on the beaches of Australia.